I've been part of history. Back in 2014, I appeared on a panel on a CNN show that subsequently went on to become one of the most widely ridiculed and mocked shows in CNN history.
What if it was hijacking or terrorism or mechanical failure or pilot error? But what if it was something fully that we don't really understand? A lot of people have been asking about that, about black holes and on and on and on and all of these conspiracy theories. Let's look at this. Noah says, what else can you think about? Black hole, Bermuda Triangle. And then Deji says, just like the movie Lost. And of course, they're also referencing the Twilight Zone, which has a very similar plot. That's what people are saying. I know it's preposterous, but is it preposterous, you think, Mary?
Well, it is. A black hole is about, a small black hole would suck in our entire universe, so we know it's not that. Bermuda Triangle is often weather, and Lost is a TV show. So
Right.
I think I always like things for which there's data, history, crunch the numbers. So for me, those aren't there, but I think it's wonderful that the whole world is trying to help with their theories, and I absolutely love the theories.
To the American culture of 2014, suggesting a plane could get swallowed by a black hole was so dumb as to be laughable. But how times have changed. Today, one of the most popular pieces of MH370 content is a video that purports to show MH370 being swallowed by, well, not a black hole, but a wormhole or an interdimensional portal, all while being swarmed by UFOs. Now, it's no skin off my nose, but since I have an MH370 site, people are always writing in saying, hey, you should check out this guy Ashton Forbes. He's figured out what happened to MH370. Or, hey, what do you think about Ashton Forbes and the UFOs that kidnapped MH370? I've been resisting putting in my 2 cents, but okay, fine. Today, I'm going to talk about Ashton Forbes, and I'm going to tell you what I think about the UFOs that stole MH370. Hi everybody, Jeff Wise here. You know, the reason I do this show is because I want to find MH370. And last week I did a show where I talked about some concrete steps that we as a community can take to help make that happen. But it isn't enough to just figure out what happened to the plane. You have to convince the world that you've figured it out. And that mission is complicated when the information environment is so overwhelmed with misinformation. So today we're going to talk about one of the major vectors of misinformation that's out there right now. To help me is an old friend and veteran journalist, David Dunbar. He was my editor at Popular Mechanics. He was the guy that sent me on a lot of my crazy adventures that I got to do. He's also someone who knows all about conspiracy theories, having walked into the lion's den with the publication of his 2005 book, Debunking 9/11 Myths. So I'm super excited to welcome him onto the show today. David, it's so great to have you here with me today. I have known many smart, wonderful people in my life. You're the first one who has come on my podcast.
Thank you.
Everybody else has been like various experts and stuff that I've sourced that are like kind of relevant specifically to MH370. But I wanted to have you on because, first of all, you're fun to talk to. And secondly, you're smart. And thirdly, you have, I think, really relevant expertise, which is that little background, you and I worked together when you were at various publications, but for the longest amount of time at Popular Mechanics. At that time, you worked on a book about 9/11 and how it happened, and it wasn't primarily about conspiracy theories, but these conspiracy theories kind of came after you, is that right?
We noticed that they started burbling up not long after the events of September 11th, and I would credit my old boss, Jim Meggs, who's the editor-in-chief of Popular Mechanics, for noticing not just the conspiracy theories, because there are some things that just beyond proving and had nothing to do with Popular Mechanics, like the attack was planned by Mossad or those kinds of things.
Right.
But then Jim started noticing that a number of the conspiracy theories fell within the bailiwick of the magazine, which was a science and technology magazine. He decided to fact check, essentially, those tangible claims that had some kind of connection with the world that we all inhabit.
I know you have a copy of the book with you. Can you hold it up and tell us what the name is?
Sure, it's Debunking 9/11 Myths.
Okay.
Why conspiracy theories can't stand up to the facts.
It's so interesting, and I want to sort of say up front why I think this is directly relevant to the topic of the podcast, which is, of course, MH370, which is that, in the previous episode, I was trying to talk about ways we can find evidence to move forward towards a true scientific understanding of the case, towards sort of trying to ground ourselves in reality of understanding this real world situation. But we're doing so in the context of an information environment which, if anything, has only gotten more fraught since you did your book. I think that's safe to say. But I think maybe, and why I want to talk to you, because I think the information environment that you sort of thrust yourself into, as if you were thrusting yourself into a hornet's nest, is one which is, it's interesting, actually. It can be very, very frustrating, but it's also interesting. We need to understand it. And there's been a lot of research in recent years with increasing urgency because of this epistemic environment we're in, of how epistemic environments develop, communities mutate and change and evolve and split and converge and all of this. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, so that we can understand the dynamics in which we exist, the challenges that we face in trying to arrive at a kind of sense of reality. So sorry for kind of front-loading all that onto you, but I really do want to understand what your experience was in this community, because you really went into the lion's den with this book.
Yeah, we had no idea the kind of, I guess the usual metaphor is the rabbit hole, what kind of rabbit holes we were going to go down. And I would say we weren't prepared initially for the kind of vitriol that seems characteristic of a lot of these communities, online communities that have a cherished theory, a cherished belief, and they don't want to see it attacked. They don't want to see it bunked. And I would have to say, we talk a lot about science and intangible evidence in the book, but I have to say that certain sectors of this world, the conspiracy world, are really impervious to rational discussion. And there's all sorts of defensive measures that they take where they don't really have to acknowledge what would be widely held views or widely accepted evidence. And and in the book, I think at one point we call it sort of a heads I win, tails you lose kind of mentality, so that everything can be incorporated into a worldview. For example, in the book we talked about some of the trail of evidence, really, of physical evidence that linked the hijackers, the 19 hijackers, to the events of the day. So, for example, the rental car that the hijackers used, was left behind at Logan Airport, of course. Mohammed Atta's suitcase didn't make it on the flight from Portland to to Boston that morning because there was a delay. So his luggage was left behind at Logan, and when they opened it up, the officials opened it up, they found flight uniforms, they found flight manuals, and they found a last will and testament written in Arabic. And there were various passports found at various crash sites. So that seems kind of locked down. But to a certain type of conspiracist, that's just like, well, how convenient, that all these things were found. That's suspicious in and of itself. So they must have been plants.
So this is called like motivated reasoning, right? If you have a desire to believe in certain storyline, you can see every piece of evidence that comes over the transom through that lens that allows you to understand it in that way. And if it flatly contradicts it, you can either just fail to see it, or you can say that it's planted. It's very hard to convince somebody of something that they really don't want to be convinced of. And I should quickly really add, and emphasize that this is not some kind of mental illness or thing or something that's peculiar to people whose brains are broken or something. This is something that is universal to all people, myself included, yourself included. This is just how the human brain works, where we are not strictly rational computers where we just can analyze things in some sort of perfect way. And there's a really interesting paper I was going to send you, but I ran out of time, that I wanted to tell you about. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of kind of academic work looking at conspiracy theories. And there's a really interesting paper by an academic named Katerina Dutil-Novayas, which was published this year in a journal called Inquiry, an interdisciplinary journal of philosophy. And the paper is called How Conspiratorial Beliefs Spread and How Real Conspiracies Are Covered Up. And she makes the point that, yes, there are these communities that build up around false beliefs and people form their identity around it, people become emotionally invested. And QAnon, very famously, people can kind of go down these rabbit holes and kind of spin off the rails, and now their family isn't talking to them and so forth. But she makes the point that, yes, those things do happen, but there are actually also real conspiracies do happen. And sometimes it can be really hard to tell what is a delusional conspiratorial belief and what is an actual conspiracy that your belief in it is actually quite well justified. It's really challenging. There isn't a litmus paper that we can stick in it and find out what's true or not. And a really interesting case right now is the lab leak hypothesis. I have my opinion about it. Pretty much everyone who has looked at it has an opinion about it. But I think it is legitimately I think it's fair to say that that is undecided. We don't really know. We haven't kind of reached consensus as a society as to what the status of that theory is. Is it delusional or is it actually true? Sorry.
I was going to say that I think I totally agree with that. There are some conspiracies, and there are conspiracies of silence. I mean, they're well documented, and it feeds a justification for being mistrustful of all government information. And and there's a healthy skepticism that we all should have, I would submit. And then there's this kind of skepticism that morphs into something stranger. And for example, like in the book, we talk about some of the accusations that these were the attacks on 9/11. This was a false flag operation, and it was going to be a justification for foreign intervention in Afghanistan and later Iraq and so on. And we can scoff at that perhaps, but then you read history books about the German SS troops who attacked their own radio tower in Germany, pretending to be Polish troops, and that in fact is a documented case of a false flag operation that Germany used to justify the invasion of Poland. So there are these examples.
You don't even have to go back that far. I mean, you mentioned the Iraq War. I mean, we were lied into that war. I don't think that was literally a conspiracy. And yes, 9/11 was used as a justification. I think most people, including yourself and myself, would say that it took advantage of 9/11 without having necessarily carried out 9/11.
Right.
But I want to bring it back to MH370. I'd sent you a link to some videos with this UFO video that Ashton Forbes has been retailing. And this is a little bit different from the 9/11 conspiracies in that this particular conspiracy belief is being really pushed by one person, but it is being pushed. He's been as successful as he has because it's something that people love. There is a UFO community that I think has a similar dynamic to some of these other delusional belief communities in that they really want to believe it. They're highly motivated to believe any information that remotely backs up their beliefs, and they get really angry. I mean, they have this kind of emotional aspect. Ashton has been he's been extremely popular on a bunch of YouTube podcasts. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that when he appears, he gets a lot of clicks. I mean, millions and millions of clicks. And I've talked to some of the content creators who have hosted him, and they have some fairly negative things to say about him, and they don't particularly believe what he's saying, but those sweet clicks are just addictive. And so this is an important part of the information environment that I think really didn't exist back in 2005, where you have where you have an information environment that is so dependent or so centered even really on social media, where you don't have gatekeepers. The people themselves, or maybe the algorithm is the gatekeeper, but the algorithm sees people clicking on something at a high rate, it shows it to more people, they click on it at a high rate, and then you have virality. Now, so you, David, one of the things that I think is sort of interesting about the fact that you published this book is that there was a much different hierarchy of credibility that existed at that time. You know, there were the networks, ABC, CBS News, the BBC, New York Times. Those things all exist today. But as I say, they've largely been supplanted in influence and importance by social media. And so you can't just really stand atop the media environment like a colossus and kind of give the truth downwards. It kind of filters up and sideways in every which way.
Yeah, and even those legacy media outlets, you know, are under attack for being the mainstream media, and that's just a code word for, you know, media that supports the status quo. But it's true, back in 2005, the social media landscape was nothing like it is today. But the internet itself really was an amazing tool to find like-minded conspiracy theorists. And I think, you know, there's a spectrum. Like, say on the UFO example, like, I think there's a certain part of that spectrum that treats it kind of like a parlor game, and they're having fun with it. And I think there's some of that spectrum that's, I would categorize them as opportunists. And you talk about the sweet clicks and you know, and they see money to be made. And then I think where you get the anger, and at least in my observations, where you get that anger, that's where the true believers are found. And so that's, our community's under attack, I'm under personal attack. And so that the anger component, which is really, even Richard Hofstadter, in his 1964 essay in Harper's Magazine about the paranoid style of American politics, the first line of his essay talks about how the American political forum is often filled with angry minds, and certainly that has not changed. It's only intensified. But
that's really interesting.
So one of the opportunists, in my opinion, going back to 9/11, would be the filmmakers who made Loose Change, which was kind of a Blair Witchy kind of thing. I think they were trying to ride that. In my opinion, they were not true believers. They were opportunists, and they thought they could use this quote-unquote documentary they made, just asking questions about 9/11, into a calling card for Hollywood. So I think there's also that part of the mix as well in the social media world and the conspiracy world. So,
did they go around promoting it and saying, no, this is actually true?
No, they were too careful to say, we're only asking questions, which was a frequent kind of mantra that we found among conspiracy theorists. Like, they wouldn't go out on a limb and say, this is what happened. It's like, well, we're only asking questions. So, like, you wouldn't say necessarily that Muhammad Atta's suitcase was an FBI plant. You would just say, oh, how convenient. Well, we're only asking questions about how this came to be, you know. So
that's really interesting.
It's kind of a chicken sort of approach to it, but it was a...
So there's a person that follows me on social media that was, a couple of days ago, was like pestering me because an Australian journalist who had written about MH370 disappeared, and this is the kind of thing that seems suspicious. And this person's like, why don't you find answers? Like, why don't you dig into this? And I'm like, it seems weird. I don't know. What am I going to do with that? There's nowhere it's going to take me. It's, this kind of just asking questions. There were all these software engineers aboard MH370. Why don't you go look at that? I'm like, well, I don't know. I guess it sounds like kind of uncanny, but it doesn't lead me anywhere. And so what you get is this kind of fog of suspicion and like nothing is really reliable. Peter Pomerantsev wrote this book that even just the title of it is a meal. Nothing is true and everything is possible. And it kind of refers to the kind of information environment that an autocracy really thrives in is one in which the people are unable to really get their hands on the truth. Everything is very slippery and amorphous. Nothing can be pinned down. You know, if you think of truth as like a stone tower that you build brick upon brick upon brick, if those bricks aren't solid, you can easily knock it over. And so if you're trying to make a tower of BS, you don't build it up like a stone tower. You just have to be kind of weaving and dodging all the time. And, you know, it's very hard to get any traction. The Peter Pomerantsev quote is this idea that you promote this idea that like no source of information can really be trusted. But at the same time, so you're very skeptical, you're very cynical about the sort of the truthworthiness of anything. But then that skepticism is partnered somewhat paradoxically with credulity, with this idea that like some other idea comes down the pike that doesn't really have any kind of factual underpinnings, and you grab onto it with both hands. Yeah. And so there's no real, it's like faith, it's like religious faith, and like you're grabbing onto something for no real discernible reason, except it just feels, it's all vibes, it's what feels like you need to
It's an emotional truth that you were talking about earlier, rather than a truth based on facts. And I suppose Pomerantz wouldn't include his own book in that category of everything that's presented to you as false, right?
No, I mean, I think he's trying to fight back against that. I mean, I think people who are aware of that kind of mentality, that kind of mindset, that sort of, which was so prevalent in MH370, which was, you know, when MH17 was shot down, and that was kind of very easily discernible to have been done by the Russians.
Right.
It was so easy to say the Russians did this, but they had flooded the zone with all kinds of crazy theories. The Ukrainians did it, the Americans did it. Maybe the plane was actually MH370, and it was all nonsense. But again, you create it's a sort of smoke screen in which nothing is easily discernible. There is no concept of truth. You know, you create your own sense of gibberish and incoherence, and then you say everything is coherent and gibberish. So your book was about debunking, right. You know, and I think when the Trump era began, there was a lot of belief in this idea of, okay, we're going to debunk. Every time someone tells a lie, we're going to debunk it. And that turned out to be, in my opinion, not a very successful experiment. And the problem is that when you debunk people, they can very much turn around and debunk you. And I don't know if you encountered that, if like you would say, oh no, this thing actually isn't true, and then other people would say, oh no, David is actually, he's the one who's lying now.
Well, that did come up actually out of left field. Popular Mechanics it still is a Hearst-owned title, and people dredged up yellow journalism and Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, yellow journalism in promoting, I think it was promoting the Spanish-American War. Mm-hmm. And so naturally, given that lineage, you know, that straight line from William Randolph Hearst all the way to Popular Mechanics in the 2000s, you know, that's clear evidence that we were the ones doing the lying.
You're a tool of the CIA, probably.
Exactly. Well, Jim Meigs, the editor-in-chief, and I were accused, and I think with a straight face, that we were actually CIA black ops trained agents.
That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, I thought, well...
I mean, can you kill somebody with your bare hands?
I cannot, actually.
That's what you would say, though, of course.
Of course I would say that, but
right.
I actually
I'm not going to mess with you.
But, you know, we were talking about credulity, and with regard to the UFOs, snatching the MH370 and taking it to another dimension or somewhere. And I think one area that we found with 9/11, that credulity question, came in the kind of expansionism of conspiracy theories. Like they have to get to when new information is introduced, it has to be debunked from the conspiracy theorist's point of view. And what happens is the cast of ruthless, tight-lipped conspirators just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So, for example, when we would cite engineering reports created by civil engineers from academia, from private industry, and from government employees, it was automatically disregarded because, of course, it was a government-related organization, NIST, National Institute for Technology and Standards, just like right out of the gate. So all of those civil engineers, all of those academics, all of the participants in the NIST study were somehow co-conspirators in this big cover-up. And it's just ludicrous on its face. And say the stand-down order, that was one of the theories that was posited. Like, why weren't F-16 jets scrambled to intercept the hijacked airliners? And there's a whole long list of reasons why that didn't happen. But just on the stand-down order alone, that would have to mean the military was involved, chain of command, all the way to the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, certainly the White House would have to be involved. And it just keeps expanding and expanding.
Well, now that exact dynamic is played out in MH370, where for Ashton Forbes' story to make any sense, the plane had to have been abducted basically through a wormhole pretty soon after it disappeared from primary radar, meaning that all of the Inmarsat data for the next 6 hours was fabricated. Well, where does the Inmarsat data come from? Inmarsat actually has ties to like the American security establishment. That's real, actually. That's not a conspiracy. And of course, Malaysia does joint military exercises with the United States. So the military is a great focus for conspiratorial beliefs because they're powerful, they're secretive, they get up to bad stuff all the time for real. They kind of deserve our suspicion, frankly. But you're right, where it gets a little bit hard to swallow is when it involves millions of people across broad swaths of government. In the case of MH370, one of the other theories that's gotten a lot of traction, it was actually in the Netflix documentary as well, is Florence Tshanghi's idea that the American military shot the plane down, and somehow the pieces just of debris that would have rained down on the South China Sea just didn't get collected or something. But
that always raises a question that rarely gets answered: is motivation. Like, why in this case, why would the U.S. military shoot down that civilian airliner?
Well, it's because they would. That's because that's the sort of thing that they would do, right? That's the answer. It's just as simple as that. That's ultimately all they really have. There's a lot of people, including some very prominent family members of the disappeared passengers, who are like, yeah, the Americans would do this. That's the kind of thing that they would do. And conversely, but that kind of same critical light can be shined back on me. I have kind of famously posited that the Russians did it, and it's not just me. And people say, well, you just think the Russians would do anything. You just think the Russians are evil. That's why you would suggest this. And I'm like, actually, no. There's mathematical reasons why I think the Russians did it. I actually don't dislike Russians as people. I don't have a lot of fondness for Putin himself, but the information environment does become a kind of hall of mirrors, where you shine an accusatory light on someone and it just reflects back at you. And so you say, well, this is fake news, and then that person says, no, you're fake news. The word fake news is more used by Trump against his attackers than vice versa, Yeah.
When there have been civilian airliners shot down by military, first of all, there is a rationale. It was an incorrect rationale, but like when the Soviets shot down the Korean airliner, they thought it was encroaching on airspace, and they thought, who knows what was said between their air traffic controllers and the pilots, but that was not challenged as the sequence of events. But just to say, well, that's the kind of thing that the American military would do, shoot down a rat. Like, why MH370? Like, what's the answer to that? And there is no real answer if that's your thesis.
No, but I did just to put a pin in this topic. People are constantly. There have been a lot of videos debunking Ashton Forbes, but then he goes on podcasts and says, no, I have actually debunked the debunkers. It's this like Matryoshka doll of like, I debunked you, you debunked me, I debunked you. Everyone's debunking everybody, and who do you want to believe? I mean, ultimately, we form judgments less on rigorous analytical analysis than on vibes, on who's got the better cut suit, who's got the more expensive production values, who's got the better title, and so forth. And sometimes those, it's easy to fake a good suit. It's easy to have a credential that isn't really relevant, etc. But it keeps us on our toes, and it makes this a very challenging exercise that we're trying to fight our way through. And I don't really know what the answer is. I mean, I've been doing this podcast now for over a year, and I mean, I get a couple thousand views, and people who make videos based on some of these ridiculous ideas are getting millions of views. So I'm very much losing the information war as we speak. But I don't know. All you can do is try to go into battle and see what you can do and what you can learn, and fight your battles and take your lumps and see if you can come out on top.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer the term fact-checking, which doesn't make a very good book title, to debunking. Because really what you're doing is you're assembling facts and tangible evidence to try and prove your case. And I think a different wrinkle in the current fake news wars is that ability to manipulate video and photography and so on to try and create your own reality.
Right.
In fact, nobody who is proposing that theory of controlled demolition bothered to talk to engineers or experts in the field of controlled demolition. We phoned up the president of the biggest demolition company in New York, and we said, well, what would it take to have a controlled demolition of buildings like the World Trade Towers? And he said, well, first of all, it couldn't be done. There's nothing on the market big enough.
But I think you have an unusual perspective, David, which is that you've been a reporter. You've spent years calling up sources, and you have it seems kind of obvious to you because you've been doing it for so long. But for most people, they're not in the habit of calling up experts. They're not in the habit of sifting through enough data, talking to enough people that you could really get a sense of who's the expert and who's not. For most people who don't do this for a living, if someone comes forward and starts speaking in a very technical way, or has an impressive job title or an impressive academic credential, they will tend to believe that person. And I don't think that's a shameful thing. I think that's just, it's hard to figure out in a complex world what is true and what is not. One of the things that Ashton Forbes does when he goes on his podcasts is to talk, he throws around a lot of really what we used to call 25-cent words. They're probably like $5 words now. But a lot of fancy words go a long way to making people think that you're serious. Yeah. We also have a problem of like inappropriate credentials. Like a lot of people are going on TV and saying, well, I'm a 777 pilot and I know what this pilot would do, or I have an insight into what happened with this case. Those people have actually taken up a lion's share of the public's understanding of what happened to this plane.
Well, the platforms are so much more available to anybody who wants to pass themselves off as an expert in any field. But I think, we talked earlier about a healthy skepticism, which is really critical. So I think even if you're not in the journalism field, regardless, there are many situations in your ordinary life where, you have to ask critical questions. Somebody's trying to sell you home insurance. Do I really need earthquake insurance, or is it a waste of money? Or, just as an example.
Yeah.
So I think even quote unquote civilians are experienced in this kind of inquiry. But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, as you well know, to sift through all the data to find the really credible source, to go upstream to find the initial report, for example.
Right.
And it's just easier to keep circulating the same ideas and reinforcing the same ideas in the echo chamber of the internet or social media. And it's a lot less work. And like we were saying earlier, I was saying earlier, you know, I think that appeals to the part of the spectrum that finds it kind of a parlor game.
Right.
And they're not going to be motivated to really dig into aviation, aeronautics, engineering, whatever. I mean, that's not why they're.
I mean, I get it. Frankly, there used to be a newspaper called the Weekly World News, and you would buy it at the checkout at the grocery store. Yeah. And one story I remember particularly was there was a front page story that scientists had found a B-17 bomber on the moon. And I thought that was great. I thought that was really great. I can imagine people coming at, you know, MH370 is somewhat sacred to me. I've invested a lot of time and effort trying to understand it in a serious way. Right. And so I'm kind of humorless about it, frankly. But I can get how people like the excitement of a sort of dumb but fun theory.
Yeah, and they set aside the horrible disaster of the event. Right. For example, MH370. I mean, there are families who still don't know what happened to their loved ones. And that's not something to make a sport out of.
David, I really appreciate your taking the time, and I want people to check out your book. Can you hold it up one more time?
Sure. I think it's still on sale.
Debunking 9/11 myths. I want to try to land at a point that is somewhat conclusive. And I know that we can just throw up our hands and feel like, actually, the situation has gotten worse since you tried to push back against this conspiracy community. Mm-hmm. And if anything, a lot of theories that had kind of lain dormant seem to have resurfaced. I mean, I was shocked when people are talking about flat Earth again. I mean, I just don't get it. But I think that there is a useful distinction. It's not just we're all the same, we all have our strange beliefs, and there's no way to really reconcile that or find some clarity. I think there is an important distinction to be drawn, and it's this. If you follow conspiracy theory, it's all about vibes and gut feeling and being suspicious and then jumping onto ideas that you think are appealing. It doesn't take you anywhere. You just spin around and spin around. And a real scientific inquiry will get you somewhere. A good scientific question will pose a question that can be answered. So you don't just wonder something, but you figure out how to answer it. And so in the last episode, I was talking about how we can get new data that can help us shed light on some of the really mysterious aspects of this case. We can move forward. If you have a question that will shed light, you're basically making a prediction. You're making a hypothesis. You're saying, I think it's either this or it's that. And you can, by testing your hypothesis, you have a way of gauging whether it's real or not. And so I think someone like Ashton Forbes, he's come forward with this footage that's very intriguing and enticing. And if you're full of doubts about the mainstream, it's very fun to believe in it. It doesn't get you anywhere. There's nothing you can do with it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Maybe this is my mantra. I'm not here to sell a theory. I'm here to find the plane. All I'm interested in is finding the plane. And theories and ideas and all of this hullabaloo is all in service of something else. It's not a goal in itself. Believing, having that good feeling, having that vibe is not a goal. It's not what we're ultimately seeking. We're seeking something that is rooted in reality. I want to find the plane. I want to know what happened to these people. And I want, ultimately, the survivors, the family members of the disappeared people to have a sense of closure. That's my little sermon for the day. Because I don't think it is just like endless, tail chasing.
No, it isn't. For people who are sincere about it, it isn't. For the people who want to have something to amuse themselves with, they're happy to go around in circles. But that's not what we're talking about.
I mean, ultimately, and I kind of want to leave it here, which is that I will never get more clicks than Ashton Forbes. But what I can do is try to solve the case, which he will never do. He will claim to have solved the case. I think ultimately only a small minority of human beings will find it anything other than ridiculous. And I think that if we exert ourselves to our maximum effort. That's all we can do, is exert ourselves to our maximum effort to try to gather plausible facts and seek the advice of serious experts. We will piece it together as best we can. I'm optimistic that we can actually solve the case. I get more and more excited the more I do this podcast, but we just have to keep fighting. That's all I can say, and we might not win, but there's always going to be crazy beliefs, and I will probably share. I'm sure I have erroneous beliefs, right? But I appreciate you coming on, David. You are an old friend, a cherished friend, a very smart and fun person to talk to, and I'm glad I've got to share you with the world, or at least the tiny fraction of the world that watches this podcast. But thank you very much. Is there anything? Do you have any parting thoughts you'd like to share?
I don't. Just keep digging.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what kind of info is going to turn the corner on MH370, but if anybody's going to find it, it's going to be you. Thank you for
Thank you
on your show.
Thanks very much. Okay. Take care, David. Thank you. Thanks again to David Dunbar for joining me for that interview. We filmed that last Friday, the same day that I posted the video about looking for new MH370 evidence by putting a flaperon in the ocean and tracking the development of sea life on it, among other things. Didn't know at the time what kind of response that was going to get. Would like to do a quick community radar about that right now. In short, it got a really great response, tons of ideas and feedback from people. In the next episode, I'm going to delve into some of those ideas and have more ideas along those lines. But for now, I just wanted to talk about one idea, which was people saying you could get a lot of information from putting one flaperon in the ocean, but what if it breaks? What if you lose it? What if something goes wrong? Maybe it would be smarter, safer, and also you would get more data if you put multiple objects in the water, other flaperons, maybe other drifters like the Global Drifter Project uses. I think that's a great idea. That opened up another idea, which is, actually there are all these global drifters in the ocean right now. What if we retrieved some that have a known location history, temperature history? We can work backwards to correlate the place in the ocean that this drifter has been, the temperature of the water that it's been in. We could learn a lot, and I think that's a really exciting idea. I will be talking more about that in episodes to come. Suffice to say, I think we're off to a really exciting direction regarding drifters. It's just the nature of this podcast that I'm a week behind always. So look forward to more about drifters, flaperons, gaining new data. For now, let me leave it at that and say, don't stop looking and don't stop asking tough questions. See you next time.